Hello, welcome to Betfair AFL Trade Talk. I'm Tom Haylock. Off the bench, I've taken the vest off and I'm joined by the MVP, Darren Parkin. How are you, great man?
Going well, mate. Yeah, Carl off in South Australia, getting ready to get married. But a big start to the season.
Yes.
I think that one of the major takeaways was Port Adelaide's performance against Brisbane. I don't know whether it says more about Port or more about the Lions, who were pretty ordinary. We'll obviously find out in the run, and a bit of a statement from the Pies as well.
Yes, well, the round started, obviously the season started with a draw, a pretty low-scoring draw, Richmond versus Carlton on Thursday night. What did you make of that match?
Yeah, it was a scrappy match. I think Richmond 66 inside 50s for 8 goals. They'd be disappointed with that. They probably feel, even though they kind of pinched the draw in the last minute, that they were the team that perhaps should have won the game. So what was your major takeaway from the first couple of days?
I think initially Carlton's leadership. I think they lack depth in their leadership. Patrick Cripps is the man that stands up, and he's been carrying the team for so many years now, but it's on him without their other key midfielder as well. It was Cripps or bust, and I think they needed to stand up in the last few seconds or minutes of that match. And Richmond probably, they are such an experienced outfit as well. They've been there, done it. They probably got the draw, and they would have felt like they had probably won, even though you said they might have dominated the match a bit more.
Yeah, and it probably, for Carlton, it was a bit of a flashback to the end of last season, those Melbourne and Collingwood games, and obviously they were immediately confronted with that scenario again, and unfortunately, in terms of the first test, they weren't able to get over the line, but at least they get some points out of it, and it doesn't get easier. They played Geelong this week.
I can't wait for this week. There's a couple of really key matchups. Also, initially, Brisbane, they were competitive early. When the acid test came after half-time, Port Adelaide ramped it up. I just thought their leaders needed to stand up as well. Speaking of leaders, I thought Carlton's leadership in the last couple of minutes, but then Brisbane after half-time, their midfield, they've got an experienced midfield now. I thought they were very disappointing.
Yeah, third quarter, I think it was 105 disposals to 50. I think their best four midfielders didn't take a mark or laid 2 or 3 tackles between them through that period. They went from 18 points up to losing by 10 goals to a Port Adelaide team that had obviously missed the 8 last year, but one that we expect to improve. I mentioned last week that Port Adelaide had a 2-9 record last year against top 8 teams, so they had to make a statement. And
they also started the year slowly.
That's
so
right.
They needed to make a statement on that.
Zipping 5 last year, so that's about as big a statement as they could have made, and how they played Collingwood and what's turned into a blockbuster this week.
I can't wait for this round. 4 new coaches this season, going into this season, all with victories. So the teams have stood up. Port Adelaide, Collingwood, Brisbane. What am I talking about? GWS were one of them.
Yep.
And then the others?
St Kilda, North and Essendon.
Yes,
although 3
correct.
of them were old coaches coaching again. So
Ross
Clarkson
Lyon
at North, Ross Lyon back at the Saints, Brad Scott at the Bombers, and obviously the new coach was Adam Kingsley at the Giants as a first-timer. But 4 from 4, and I think that the chances of that happening when you consider the seasons Essendon had, when you consider the seasons the Giants had and North had, the Saints were kind of middle of the road, but I don't think you would have got a reasonable market on that happening, I think.
Especially with Adelaide coming on off a bit of a hype, GWS losing some key players, Taranto and alike. And the round ended with St Kilda Fremantle. It was a return to the old Ross Lyon days. Low scoring, real tricky, competitive, defensive kind of mindset, and ended up 67-52. So low score and pretty average game to round out the round.
Yeah, and the Saints obviously had to do that with a lot of their forwards unavailable. I think they had 8 or 9 of their best 22 out, but Max King and Tim Membry, their 2 main forwards, not playing, and they were able to just suffocate Fremantle. We mentioned that Richmond had 66 inside 50s for 8 goals. Fremantle had 65 for 7 goals. They had 21 inside 50s in the last quarter, Fremantle, but didn't kick a goal in that term. So, the Ross Lyon squeeze was back.
The Ross Lyon of old. Obviously, a lot of movers and shakers as round one caused a few upsets, a few surprise results throughout round one. The big one was Sheezel. His debut was outstanding.
34 touches. I think it's the 3rd most possessions by a debutant. And I called a lot of the NAB League last year where he played mainly forward. So he was a mercurial forward, a sensational player, but spending a lot of time in the midfield, 34 touches, 9 marks. And he was, I think our man Tom Happel, when he did the North Melbourne preview, spoke about him in Rising Star Markets. He was $16 when it opened, Harry Sheezel. He's now $3.30, second favourite behind Ashcroft at Brisbane, who kicked a blinder for his first goal in league footy. But yeah, Harry Sheasel, it's going to be very difficult to. They haven't announced the nomination yet, but you can give it to him for this week.
Would have thought so.
And yeah, there's every chance he's going to be pretty hard to beat. And obviously a bit of movement as we expected around top 4, top 8 and flag as well.
Yeah, well, Collingwood were the big mover, caused a semi-upset against Geelong. They were $3.70 into $2.10 for the top 4 market. They're out to $2.30 now, so the money came early when they got the victory, and they've just drifted slightly back out at $2.30. But $3.70 into $2.30, their overall firm, considerable market move there. We've got Melbourne $1.43, Geelong $2.04. Collingwood now third favourites, ahead of Brisbane in that top 4 market at $2.30. Brisbane $2.32, Richmond $2.44. Anything you like in that market?
Yeah, they are legit, the Pies. Obviously, Brisbane have got to stand up. But if you look at Brisbane's first month, so they got Melbourne this week, then the Bulldogs at Marvel, which is not an easy game, and then they play Collingwood. So they're going to have to be very careful not to be 0-4, the Lions, I would think. But we'll more on them later. But yeah, I think Collingwood definitely legit. Geelong, they played well for large parts of that game. Got a few injuries. I wouldn't worry too much. But I think both myself and a couple of others last week were saying that Melbourne, you can mount a very strong case that they're the best team in the comp. And yeah, nothing on the weekend would have changed that thought.
No, they've firmed into $5.50 for the overall market now. So they're clear favourites ahead of Geelong. $8, Collingwood $8.60, Brisbane $9.80, Richmond $10, Sydney $10.50. They've done nothing wrong. Sydney at $10.50 obviously came out and provided a good win. Couple of matchups this round are going to change the overall market as well. For Thursday night, we've got a blockbuster as well. So looking forward to seeing how that shapes up. Just looking at that premiership market, who are you leaning to there? Are Melbourne the clear standouts?
I think so. I mean, I think Melbourne, Geelong and Collingwood are 3 that we can say can definitely win it. Brisbane have got the runs on the board, top 4 3 or 4 times in a row, but that was a stinker on Saturday, so they need to respond. And Sydney, you've obviously got to clearly respect them. There was all that talk around sides that get belted in grand finals and falling away, but they've shown no signals that they'll do that. And as a result, you'd have to consider them firmly amongst it, I would think.
Yes. What do you make of round 1 performances overall, Darren? Because I generally see, and you look back at round 1s in the past, it actually is a fair indication of form.
Yeah.
Obviously, Port were awful at the start of the year. They were 0-5 last year, but they made amends and came to the late run late. But do you think that round 1 will stack up, or are we going too soon with some of these predictions?
I think so. I mean, obviously, it's hard to read, say, North Melbourne, West Coast, Giants, Crows, those sorts of things. But I think it's hard to doubt that, St Kilda will be competitive under Ross Lyon. I think they showed that they've got a bit of a brand that's going to be repeatable.
Boring brand.
I think Melbourne demonstrated that they're pretty good like we thought. Collingwood showed that they backed up what they did last year. Port Adelaide showed that they've hit back. I think we can trust most of what we take out of it.
I can't wait to find out more about a few teams. Collingwood, Port, blockbuster off what we saw round 1. Carlton Geelong's another one. Carlton have got to stand up, and Geelong have got to bounce back. You don't want to see Geelong go 0-2, and Carlton, a good side, if they want to stamp themselves and make them a top 8, top 4. Some people are mentioning top 4s for Carlton, the big improver this year. They've got to really do it now on Thursday night against Geelong. Yeah,
and the other one being Brisbane-Melbourne. So what are Brisbane made of? They got flogged by Melbourne at the Gabba in the last round of last season, but then beat them in the finals a couple of weeks later. Melbourne flying, Brisbane reeling, but not a lot of injuries. So Lions back at the Gabba, can they hit back and I guess answer those critics and confirm that they haven't gone anywhere? So that's a big game.
Let's have a look at some markets. So Carlton go into the game currently at $2.66 versus Geelong at $1.58. Which way are you leaning there?
Geelong slightly. I think that's about right. Carlton definitely a chance, but I think the Cats, there were reasons for what happened against Collingwood, and obviously the Magpies, I think, are a little bit ahead of Carlton at the moment. Not by a mile, but a bit ahead of them. So Geelong just.
I thought Brisbane were a great chance against Port, and they were even money last weekend in round 1 against Port. Obviously, very disappointing after half time. They're even money again. Melbourne, they'll start about $1.95 potentially. Melbourne versus Brisbane, $2.
D's for me.
You're happy to take the D's there?
Yep.
And then the other big one we mentioned, Collingwood, Port Adelaide. Collingwood go in as $1.61 favourites at home against Port, who are $2.50.
Yeah, probably a better price than we were going to get on Collingwood after Friday night. So I'm happy with the $1.61. I reckon before the Port game, they might have put Collingwood up $1.28, $1.30 in that match. So yeah, pretty happy with that.
Any other games of interest? Adelaide need to bounce back against Richmond.
They
Adelaide
do.
Outsiders 234, first home game for the year. They've got to show something there.
They do, but the Tigers also wouldn't want to go draw-loss to start the season. The issue would also be the heat. Adelaide, obviously, 6-day break. It was 37 in Sydney for their game on the weekend.
Players cramping everywhere.
Cramping. Obviously, they are flying back home, so that helps a little bit. But yeah, that might be a factor early.
Just on that, huge win by GWS. New coach. They had players down. They had 2 come off with head injuries. Harry Perriman off early with an injury as well. So they were down and out, and they kept finding late in the last quarter in that heat.
Yeah, in the third quarter they swamped the Crows, and then they held them off in that last quarter. The likes of Hogan and Green kicking 7 between them. Yeah. And even Daniel with a couple of late goals was really important. So that's a win full of merit for the Giants.
Both Greens, Tom and Toby, fantastic there. GWS, tough market against West Coast.
Yeah.
On the last game on Sunday evening, West Coast outsiders for that match you would have thought, but GWS coming off, as you said, a hot match with some injury concerns, without a couple of players likely to miss with their injuries.
So West Coast looked ordinary. Obviously, they got a bit of run late against North and nearly took it from them, but overall they look like they're a fair way off the pace. Giants, I don't think they're a top 8 team, but they showed they've got a bit of resilience. So it's really a case of Eagles at home versus a side that's probably slightly ahead of them, but injury ravaged and travelling. So yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah,
tough one. Bulldogs, another big talking point. They were very disappointing. Connectivity between the midfield and the forward line really struggled. They looked lacklustre. They'll need to stand up against St Kilda.
Yeah, and they would have seen what St Kilda are going to do. The Saints will try to squeeze them. So they squeeze the corridor. The Saints are missing forwards, so they can't afford it to be a 15-goal-a-side game. But yeah, it's not going to come easy for the Dogs trying to get their first win next week.
All right, let's get to buy, hold and sell here. Darren, who are you buying this week?
Buying Sydney just based on that price. I think there's still a bit of caution around them, like how they're going to respond from last year. I think they've shown that they're fine. Obviously, they'll face big tests when they play Geelong and Melbourne and teams like that going forward. But I think they're probably 5th or 6th in line for top 4 and top 8 and flag and all of that sort of stuff. But I would argue they should be a little bit higher than that. Obviously, with Geelong, Collingwood and Melbourne setting the pace, I'd have Sydney not too far behind them. So I'm buying the Swans. Who are you buying?
A couple of interesting teams that I'm buying purely from a trading perspective. Essendon needed to win against Hawthorn. They did that. They were quite impressive in what they did. They had to win, as I said. They've got a chance to go 4-0.
Yeah, they do.
So you could back them now and lay off later for top 8 markets or something like that. So they're my buy this week. They've got Suns at home round 2, St Kilda and GWS round 4, so an easy draw there. And Fremantle, the other team, they have drifted now after their loss, but they've got North, West Coast and the Crows the next 3 weeks. So they could easily go 3-1 and start being a buyer now, back them now for top 8 market and potentially lay off after round 4.
Yeah, and they're good points. So Fremantle play North, as you say, and Sydney play Hawthorn, who was my buy as well. So you would expect both Freo and Sydney will win handsomely this week, which will change that market. So it'll be better this week than next week.
Let's get on the hold. You're holding Richmond.
Holding Richmond, yeah. They did a fair bit right against Carlton. Obviously, they just didn't finish the job when they went inside 50. Obviously, they left Cumberland out. You think he might play. But if they get that much ball forward of centre, they're going to be pretty hard to stop. But in saying that, obviously, they've just got to work on a few things in terms of connection. Little danger game for them this week. So I'm just trying to figure out where to slot Richmond into a ladder predictor. Are they 4th? Are they 7th? Are they in the mix to miss the 8? I don't know. But I still think they're a top 8 side. But just going to have a look.
Speaking of the ladder predictor, we've got that up on the hub.
We do indeed. So there's still some advantages there. So they work out the predictability versus the odds, and you're getting good value on things like Sydney for top 4 and those sorts of things.
Betfair.com.au/hub. Check out the predictor there. My hold, Port and Collingwood. I just want to hold off on these 2 teams before we see more of them. Obviously, a clash game this weekend. It's going to be an absolute ripper. I'm just holding on those 2 teams. There's quite a few teams that Fremantle, one of them, I didn't know what to make of them this year off a really good year last year. Collingwood did the same. And Port Adelaide were pretty average. So they're 2 teams that could go either way, and I'm just holding off. I have no idea what to make of those 2.
Yeah, and I think Collingwood, with after they play Port, they play Richmond and Brisbane at the Gabba, so it'll be interesting. And obviously with a couple of those sides playing each other this week.
Selling, who are you selling? Huh?
I was going to sell package up Queensland footy, because I thought the Gold Coast also struggled against expectation. I think they talked a pretty good game in the off season, and I think there was an expectation they'd go places. They didn't really fire a shot against Sydney on the weekend, but Brisbane, you just look at their draw. I think if you're going to sell them, better now, because I could see them losing their next 3 potentially, and that could get a bit worse.
You
for
reckon
them.
Brisbane goes 0-4?
They could. I mean, they're good enough to win any of them, but they've got Melbourne this week, which I think they'll lose. And they play the Bulldogs at Marvel, which is winnable, but also highly losable. And then they play Collingwood, who look a top 4 side after that, admittedly at the Gabba. So you think they might pinch one of the Gabba games, and they could certainly beat the Dogs, but it's not inconceivable. We spoke about Essendon going 4-0. It's not inconceivable Brisbane do the flip.
It's also not inconceivable they come out and win all 3.
Exactly.
But they need to improve on what we saw
Exactly.
round 1.
And I guess that's the risky aspect of the trading
That's
game.
the beauty. You've got to back yourself in. I'm selling Adelaide. A lot of hype throughout the year. I reckon they came in at half-time. The young team, obviously hot conditions, they might have just started believing their hype a little bit. And they were very, very plain after half-time against an injury-ravaged GWS. They've got Richmond next, and then Port Adelaide. That could be 0-3 and be very hard to make a top 8, 0-3.
Yes, I mean, they could look at it and say that they showed signs, and with Rankin getting as much ball, they probably should have been 40 points up at quarter time, conceivably, in that game, and therefore 8-9 goals up at halftime. So the game should have been done. So at least they could take some positives out of the fact that they did blitz the Giants when they were up.
They looked really good.
Yeah,
in the
they
first
did.
half. Their ball movement was fantastic. Rochelle back, he was in really good form.
Yeah.
His work rate's outstanding, Rochelle. And as I said, Isaac Rankin was damaging, and he just missed a few shots on goal that probably cost Adelaide in the end. As you said, should have been up by much more earlier in the game. Backing and laying this week, Darren.
Yeah, I'm going to back the Tigers. I just think $1.62 is not a bad price against the Crows, only on the fact that Adelaide, 6-day break, as we mentioned, very hot conditions, lost a bit of momentum, which would have hit their confidence. Richmond a bit more rested. I think they played a fairly complete, solid game defensively as well the other day. So, I think Richmond, pretty good value there.
I'm going to back Fremantle top 8 market now. Not that I like them for the top 8, but I just think there's a trading opportunity. I think they can win their next 2 or 3 games and lay off a bit later. So that's my back this week. You're laying?
I'm laying Brisbane only because the game against Melbourne is pretty much even money, and I think Melbourne are the best team in the comp. And I think they've got a very good record against Brisbane. If you take that final out last year when Melbourne were really banged up, Petrarca played with a broken leg. They've owned Brisbane for the last few years, and during this run where they've been a good side, Melbourne, they've thumped Brisbane most of the time they've played them, belted them at the Gabba last year. I just think Brisbane, it'd be a fair turnaround if they beat the premiership favourites off that. I think they'll be better, but Melbourne, I think, represent good value in that.
I hope you're right, because I'm asking for a price, $11.50, Lachie Neale for the Brownlow. He's my lay this week. I'm asking for $11.50, so if people want to jump on, betfair.com.au there. He hasn't polled in the last 3 games, obviously, against Melbourne. He had 29 in round 23, 2022. So last year he had 29, but 4 AFL coaches' votes, no votes. Before that he only had 22, and before that he only had 25 in the Brownlow polling matches there. So he hasn't polled. He polled 3 in 2020 when he played the Demons. But I'm laying him. I'm happy to hopefully lay him now and back him maybe later in the year and trade that way. So what are you looking forward to most this round, mate?
It's another, obviously, round 1 was very difficult to separate, and round 2 doesn't look all that much easier. You get a couple of games like Freo at home, Sydney at home that look a bit more straightforward, but yeah, there's some really significant matches. It's a really even start. In our office here, we have the last man standing knockout competition, and it's very difficult to find your one moral of the week, although I sense that one of those 2 interstate sides will probably get the run. What about you?
Sydney look sure things to beat
You'd
Hawthorn.
so,
You would have thought they might be your knockout selection. But Carlton, Geelong and Collingwood Port are my 2 games. I can't wait for those 2. So going to be a fascinating year. Thanks for joining me, mate. It's good. Do you reckon I'll stay here, or do you reckon I'll get back on the bench for next week?
Oh no, I think we can pull some strings and make sure you stay here. So
Carl, you're done. Have another couple off.
You might replace me. Who knows?
No, you're the star of the show. Thank you for making this job very easy, Darren. We'll be back again next week on AFL Trade Talk.
Gamble responsibly. Call 1-800-858-858.